Well, I'm pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you about something a little different and about the potential impacts of cannabis emissions in the atmosphere, which is something we need to understand if we're going to have a sustainable cannabis industry. And so I'll be going through a little background about the plant volatile emissions and their environmental impacts, what we understand right now about these cannabis emissions, and including that smell, that cannabis smell, which is something we've figured out in the past year. And then finally, some solutions to potential problems with cannabis emissions. So plants emit hundreds of different volatile compounds into the atmosphere. Some of those you're very familiar with, things you smell in your kitchen from plants, out in your garden. Floral scents are an obvious ones, but there are a lot of other ones as well too. Some of those we really can't smell very much. So there's a whole range of different compounds coming from different processes. So one question is, well, why are plants emitting all these various compounds? Some of them we know quite well what the physiological roles are, what the ecological roles are. An obvious one is pollination, right, bringing in the birds and bees and seed dispersers, but also a lot of it's for protection purposes. So these plants have these compounds for a reason. And some of these we know well for defense, some of them we really don't understand very well. But there are also the impacts on the ambient environment. These impacts can include very large impacts on chemistry of the atmosphere, greenhouse gases, air pollutants are impacted by these compounds. But in a clean environment, these compounds are emitted into the environment, they get oxidized, chewed up into carbon dioxide, reabsorbed by the atmosphere, so they don't have an impact. So in a clean environment, these plant volatiles don't have an impact on pollution. But it's very different in a polluted environment. And we study this in a range of different places. A really nice place where we've worked on this has been in the middle of the Amazon. So very clean, pristine area around, just plant emissions. But then you have the city of Manaus, about 2 million people, unregulated emissions, so a lot of pollution there. And we're able to go and do studies. These are studies sponsored by the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and Brazilian science agencies. We have aircraft, sampling systems downwind. And we could sit there and look at what was going on in the pristine environment and then see what happens when the Manaus plume goes over. And what happens when you get the polluted environment mixing with these plant volatiles, you make a lot of ozone, a lot of particles. And these are two major regional air quality problems. And they're also very important short-term climate forcers. So very large impacts on the environment from this. My colleague, Will Vizuete, has done work looking at in areas like here in the US, what are the impacts? And including cannabis cultivation. So he did a study looking at the emission of these plant volatiles that you'd get from cannabis cultivation. And for the particular location where it's has been grown in Denver, you can get a significant impact on ozone. Denver has an ozone problem. It's right on the edge of being in compliance for ozone. So a little bit of a push on ozone is a huge problem for Denver and Colorado. And so the way these studies are done is to go in, measure what's being emitted from the plants, and then extrapolating that with a regional air quality model where you can run the model without the cannabis emissions and then run it with the cannabis emissions, and you can see the impact of the cannabis. And that impact is up to about a ppb of ozone. And so the take-home message here is that there's potential for cannabis growing operations to have impact on air quality in some regions. Not in all regions. And again, if this were a clean area, if this were pristine in the Amazon, not near Manaus, there wouldn't be any impact at all of the cannabis emissions. But when you have it in a dirty area, particularly oxides of nitrogen around, which we have a lot of in our cities, then you can make ozone and particles. And so the idea that these volatile emissions are important for the global environment is something we've known for decades. And so these emissions are in all the global climate models, all the regional air quality models, and we've kind of worked out, the impact of forests and large-scale vegetation. More recently, though, we've realized that there also can be an impact on these urban areas, like Denver, like Los Angeles. And in the past, we kind of ignored that, both because it's so complicated to try to do the vegetation in an urban area, but also because there was so much emissions of VOCs, right? But because our regulators have done such a great job of reducing the VOC emissions in our cities, we're now at the point where we think here in Los Angeles County, the most populous county in the US, about half of the emissions of these volatile organic compounds, which impact smog, ozone, and particles, about half of it's coming from plants. And all these compounds are not equal in terms of their impact on ozone and particles. And the ones coming from plants actually have more of an impact than those coming from cars and factories. So we think it's actually more than half of the impact. Well, because we've been studying this on the global scales for a long time for these large scale impacts, we have models. We have models that we've developed and again are in all the climate models and regional air quality models. And basically you look at how much vegetation there is, look at the weather, the heat, temperature, all the things that would affect these emissions. And we do these studies going from small scales, understanding the biochemistry of what's going on, to looking at large scales where we can see how does it impact, because again, these plant VOC on their own don't have an impact, but it's when they impact with anthropogenic emissions there's a problem. So we do aircraft studies, now we have satellite data, and so we can kind of expand and look at the large scale impacts. But again, on the small scales where we can use these enclosure measurements and understand for individual plants what they emit and what controls it. So temperature, light, stress are important part of the controls. So we have these models and we using these enclosures under controlled conditions, we can figure out, well, what's controlling all of these emissions. Okay, so now back to cannabis. We first started studying this a couple of years ago, and one of the interesting things was people didn't really know what that odor was, the skunky odor. Because, of course, with cannabis, there's this potential for air quality impacts, but also just local odor impacts, right, is an important issue in a lot of areas. Talking to people in the cannabis industry, a lot of people thought, well, it's this skunky terpene. Myrcene was thrown out as a possibility. Well, I've got bottles of myrcene in my lab. I can smell it. It doesn't smell skunky at all, right? Cannabis, some of them may be a little musty, but nothing that smells like a skunk. But of course, we knew, well, the odor of a skunk is a thiol, right? And there's a lot of different sulfur compounds that have that kind of odor. Skunky beer are thiols. So we kind of keyed in on that and looking for that. And indeed, we could see in these cannabis emissions, both looking at individual plants and looking in facilities, we could see 3-methyl-2-butene-1-thiol, 321-MBT is the key compound, the key skunky smell in cannabis. And we could do that by, again, isolating the plant, looking at the emissions, so we know it's really coming directly from the plant. And of course, we use analytical techniques, TD-GC-TOF-MS to work this out. We can look at the mass spectra, compare to NIST, to authentic samples. I also compared it to a Corona beer that I stuck out in the sun for a while, and we can figure out what these thiols are. We're also working with our colleagues who do olfactometry, and so olfactometry is a technique where you're not using expensive analytical detectors, you use the person's nose, right? So we have these experts who will go through and actually have this thing going from the gas chromatograph, which separates the compounds into individual compounds, and it goes to a person's nose, and they write down, it's grassy, it's piney, it's skunky. And so this is key, right? Because we can analytically determine what's in the sample, but we need something connected to a nose and a human brain to say, hey, this is this odor that can be a nuisance issue. So a key part of this approach was combining these two, right? Combining our advanced analytical techniques and combining human sensory odor panels. And so we worked with our colleagues, Jacek Kozul and Don Wright, in combining this into an ASTM standard. So ASTM is an organization that develops these standard approaches that people can use. Because one of the problems right now with odor nuisance is there aren't standards. So, in most cases, the way agencies deal with this is somebody complains about it, right? Our monitoring system is the neighbor's nose. That's kind of what we're relying on right now. Well, the problem with that is different people are going to respond differently. It's difficult to tell. They might send someone out with a nose ranger and try to breathe, but it's a problem, right? Whereas in other parts of air quality, we have standards based on this much ozone is a problem, right? We don't have that for odor until we develop standards where we can actually quantitatively say, this is a problem here. There's an additional complication, though, in that the ratios of these odors are important. And so one potential possibility, because these thiols are really difficult to measure and they're at really low concentrations. So one possibility you might think of is, well, let's just measure the terpenes, because cannabis is emitting terpenes, it's emitting thiols. Let's go measure terpenes. And if we measure terpenes, well, then probably there's a cannabis odor. But it doesn't work that way. It's the ratios, and in fact, the terpenes can actually mask the cannabis odor. So sometimes right near the source, you can't detect that skunky odor. And it's when it goes downwind to the elementary school a couple blocks away, right, then the odor can actually be greater than it is right at the fence line. So it's somewhat complicated there. But using these so how can we solve this issue? And using these enclosure measurements, we can determine for different cannabis strains what those ratios are. And again, we're not just getting the amount of thiol, but the ratio of the thiol to the terpenes, because those ratios are really important. It's a challenge. These thiols are at really low concentrations, but we have analytical techniques that can do that. We use, again, going back to those models that we developed for global climate models and regional air quality models, we use a similar kind of approach. So we take this, we're calling it the cannabis emission profiler. Basically, we can get for a facility, for a greenhouse or a field, we can determine exactly, quantitatively, what the mass emission of thiols and terpenes are with using these enclosure measurements. And of course, we can look at differences in, juvenile, the flowering obviously are different. We need to consider these different conditions. And the solution is, well, we have techniques that can remove these compounds. Now, one approach might be, well, we have these techniques, let's just throw a bunch of it out there and remove everything we can. Well, it costs money, obviously, to put these out there. It takes a lot of energy to run these carbon scrubbers. They have to either regenerate or dispose of the carbon. So it's really important to one, know the type of carbon, right, so that you're specifically targeting those thiols and terpenes, but then right-sizing it. And so I've been working on getting, exactly how much is going out there so we can get the right amount of removal technology, but not too much, right? So we don't have the cost, we don't have the excess energy and sustainability issues. And again, for example, so we can just quantitatively determine for the size of a facility, for the emission, because we know the individual plants, what they're emitting, we can determine how many of these molecular filtration systems you need. And so Byers has been working on developing improved systems, right, in improved in terms of the efficiency, right? So the power is lower, improving the effectiveness of the carbon that's used in there, and also the ability to reuse this carbon. Right now, typically it's just thrown away into landfills, so we're going to be able to not do that anymore. And then, of course, third-party testing is important to validate that we really can remove these thiols, we can remove these terpenes. These systems are remarkably effective. We can also go beyond that to other issues that are important for cultivation, getting rid of pathogens, other kinds of things that might be important for indoor air quality for people. So ASPRA is something that's recently been added to this system for removing particles, biological particles and other particles. And again, using third-party testing, these are remarkably effective. So we have solutions for getting rid of these odors, getting rid of these particles, and our focus is on doing this effectively and including the use of smart systems that would say, hey, it's time to replace the carbon in this system, and getting real-time data. If there's some kind of a leak or an issue going on, then we can immediately, that's going to your phone and saying, hey, we've got a problem in the facility right now. So that's what I have, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. I have an outdoor cannabis farm in Sonoma County, and I'm surrounded by vineyards, and we are constantly having the conversation about our terpenes tainting their grapes and the smell, of skunky smell. Knowing that that's thiols and it's organic sulfur, vineyards use sulfur to prevent powdery mildew. Is there an argument to be made that our thiols are actually benefiting their grapes?
They could be, yeah. Yeah, it's been really interesting to me in kind of getting into this field and seeing how the vintners can dump all kinds of stuff on the vineyards, right? And the cannabis people can't. But it's really, this terpene drift issue is really interesting, and I know they've been focusing a lot on eucalyptol as one, and we've done some studies. It's a really minor component. I think it's going to be really rare. And in Australia, if you have a lot of eucalyptus trees going around, it could be an issue, but I think it's unlikely with cannabis. But again, with this kind of approach, well, then we can tell, right? We can go see exactly what are the terpenes, and then we can model exactly what's getting deposited on the grapes and calculate that and figure out. And, I think in most cases, you can clearly show that's not a problem.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, wonderful talk. I had a question, it's slightly off topic, but your expertise sounds like you may be able to answer this pretty well.
Yeah, this talk was kind of off topic for this conference too, maybe.
But a number of indoor cannabis grows in California are moving more and more towards oxidizing agents as a way to A, odor control, and B, be effective as a pesticide, an alternative to chemical pesticides. I was wondering, in indoor facilities where they're fairly clean, the use of oxidizers like, a number of different oxidizers I could talk about. ClO2 gas is one that's starting to be used more. Are we putting workers potentially in danger, or are we basically creating clean breakdown products when those oxidizers are mixing with these volatiles from the plants?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So in general, when you use oxidizers to break down these things, and just because there's so much terpene load in there and stuff like that, including, even if you've moved the plants out, right, a lot of that stuff is condensed into a film on everything, right, and that's part of what they're trying to clean up. You're going to generate all these aldehydes in there, which can be really toxic. And so I think it's a real issue. It's something people really haven't been looking at very much, what's getting created, but I think, we don't really know, but there's good reason to suspect that can really be a problem.
Sorry, as a follow-up question, can you recommend any good sensors that we could put in place in these facilities to monitor for the aldehydes and other things that might be?
Yeah, Fortunately, what we have right now, there are really good sensors and they're really expensive. And then there are really cheap sensors and they're really not very good. And that's kind of the state of the art right now. We need something more in between that can be done. But so it'd be really, and these are kind of online continuous sensors, which would be nice to have. But what can be done is kind of just grab sampling, right? So going out, collecting samples and analyzing them, and that's probably right now, that's the way to go. Another interesting thing that brings up though is that not only, people do this for cleaning and you might do that in between your harvest, but other people are suggesting you should use some kind of oxidant for just cleaning the air, right, during the normal procedures. And that's definitely going to be generating a lot of these aldehydes and things like that. And it's just that really, people need to be careful with doing that. We had looked into that, Byers has looked into that and was, thinking about that as a potential thing to use and decided, no, there's just too many risks about these products. Yeah, you get rid of that original compound, you get rid of the thiols, but you're going to generate all these small aldehydes, and it's just not going to be a good thing.